And we're going to talk a little. We've been going through a series of studies on some of the old-time missionaries in our history and what life was like for them, some of the pioneers. And so I'm following along with our next character, and his name is Adoniram Judson. And he was born in Malden, Massachusetts. 1788. I was looking at when he died, and I think the message isn't supposed to be that short. I'm supposed to have a little bit more in there. And he was the son of a very stern, humorless, congregational minister. And I guess so stern that he had kind of moved from church to church quite a bit. Adoniram was very intelligent and his father thought that he was destined for something great. He was reading at the age of 3. He excelled in mathematics and in reading. He learned both Latin and Greek and attended navigation school at the age of 10. He dreamed of sailing to faraway places. He lost his baby sister around that time. She became sick and died, and even at that point, he began to start having a hardening of his heart. He was angry at God. He'd heard his father say that everyone had to, even little babies needed to receive God as their Savior, and he thought, what is that supposed to mean? And he was just very confused, trying to listen to his father's preaching and angry that God took his sister, and that shook him. At about the age of 16, his father had him enrolled in Rhode Island College, which was later renamed Brown University. And at the age of 19, he graduated as class valedictorian. But while he was there, he befriended a man by the name of Ernest. Some people called him Jacob, so I'm not sure which one was his nickname, but Ernest Ames, or Jacob Ames. And Ernest was a devout deist and a skeptic. This is a very popular thinking amongst the collegiate of those days. The basic idea is, yeah, God created the world, but he really doesn't care enough to intervene. He doesn't care about what's going on with us small little creatures down here. He just kind of, created the earth and just kind of let it run on its own. And God doesn't really intervene or do anything today. And so his gifted, witty friend, Ernest, caused him to abandon his faith and the upbringing of his parents, and instead he embraced the writings of French philosophers. He would banter with his friend and say, well, what do you think's going to happen with your life? And Jacob Ames, or Ernest Ames, would say, well, I think maybe someday I'll be president, but first I want to kind of go explore the world and have some fun. And that idea was kind of something that Adoniram took a hold of, and he thought, yeah, I want to do some adventure and have some fun first too. So during those days, he'd written some curriculum books, some school books, but he set out on horseback and joined a tour of adventurers that was kind of like a performing or dramatic troupe, and they were going to travel out west, and he was going to explore the West. And so he joined this band of strolling players and lived what he later called a, quote, wild and reckless life. And anyway, he stopped. He left the troupe after a few weeks and continued his trip alone. And he stopped at a country inn. And the landlord of the inn said, I don't have any more places vacant. If I took you in, I would have to put you in next door to a young man who is extremely ill. In fact, he's deathly ill, and he could be dying. Judson said, I'll take the room. Death has no terror for me. You see, I'm an atheist. And so Judson retired for the night. And I'm just going to read a lot of what I'm sharing with you today is some quotes from different articles. And the quote here was, The partition was very thin, and for long hours he listened to the groans of the dying man, groans of agony, groans of despair. The poor fellow was evidently dying in terror. I suppose I should go to his assistance, but what would I say that would help him? Judson thought to himself. He shivered at the very thought of going into the presence of a dying man. He felt a blush of shame steal over him. What would his late unbelieving companions think if they knew of his weakness? Above all, what would witty, brilliant Ernest say if he knew? As he tried to compose himself, the dreadful cries from the next room continued. He pulled the blankets over his head, but still he heard the awful sounds and shuddered. Finally, all became quiet in the next room. At dawn, having had no sleep, he rose and inquired of the innkeeper what had become of the man next door. He's dead. And Judson said, "Dead? Do you know who he was?" "Yes," the innkeeper said. "He was a graduate of Providence College, the college that Judson had attended. He was a young fellow by the name of Ernest." Judson was overwhelmed by the news that the young man who had caused him to lose his faith had died the previous night in the very next room, in evident terror of the death that was awaiting him. And yet Ernest was the one who'd led him into infidelity. For many hours, the words dead lost, were ringing through in his mind. And there was just one place that beckoned him. So he turned his horse around and he headed back east. And he went home and he begged his father and mother to help him find the faith that he had lost. And he came to a saving, rededicated his life to the Lord, or came to a saving knowledge of the Lord at that time. And said Ephesians 3:17 through 19 was his great text, and the love of Christ was his theme. Henceforth he was magnificently captivated by the love of Christ as he explored the mystic meaning and abounding fullness of Christ's love, the depth, the length, the breadth, and the height of God's love. So quite a salvation experience. And I continued to be stunned as I learned about all the stuff that happened even before he became a missionary, because there were no missionary societies in America yet to send missionaries. And so he decided to travel to England to find the London Missionary Society to send him. His voyage by sea involved being captured by a French warship, and he was imprisoned in France. He showed the ingenuity which was to characterize his whole missionary life, and he escaped from the French prison and made his way back to America, arriving 8 months after he had left. And then he enrolled in Bible school at Andover Seminary. And he heard about the work of William Carey and his associates that they were opening up in India, and that influenced him about the masses of people who didn't know God, and the darkness that was over the vast expanses of Asia. He said, "More than all else, I long to please thee, my Lord, what would you have me to do?" he prayed, and he felt God's presence close to him. "Go to the uttermost part of the earth and preach the gospel of my love. I send you forth, like Paul, as a witness to distant nations." And also, like Paul, he rose up determined not to be disobedient to the Lord's commission. So he gathered some kindred spirits around him, and these young men approached some of the church leaders there, and they asked to be sent. And so Adoniram Judson became one of the very first American missionaries to be sent overseas. Now, just before he went, he had met a young lady by the name of Anne Hasseltine, and in February 5th of 1812, he married her. And they boarded a boat 2 weeks later and headed to Burma. But it's interesting, I have to divulge a little bit about their story because it's pretty crazy. You thought my story was crazy, those of you who know me. This one he's a dude, this guy, Adoniram. A month after he met her, Adoniram wrote Anne a letter asking for permission to be her suitor. Okay, this was close to what we would call a proposal. She didn't answer for several days, and then when she finally did, Anne evaded the question and said that Adoniram needed to ask her dad. This is what Adoniram wrote to her dad. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world, whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of missionary life, whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all of this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, and for the sake of the perishing, immortal souls, and for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in hope of meeting your daughter in the world of glory with the crown of righteousness, brightened with acclamations of praise, which shall redound to her Savior from the heathen saved through her means, from eternal woe and despair? Anne's dad gave his permission. So you could almost write a story, I guess, about just that, and how the dad was able to read a letter like that and give his daughter to such a man. Later, Anne wrote to one of her friends, and she said this: I feel willing and expect, if nothing in providence prevents, to spend my days in this world in heathen lands. Yes, Lydia, I have come to the determination to give up all my comforts and enjoyments here, sacrifice my affection to relatives and friends, and to go where God in his providence shall see fit to place me. So, the story gets no less exciting while they're on the boat on the way over. It wasn't like we are now, flying in just a few hours and we're there. The journey would take a very long time. And during the journey, being mentally very, always wanting to be engaged mentally, he was studying the scriptures. And remember, he was a student of Greek and Hebrew. And as he went through the scriptures, he became convinced of the Baptist ideology. And so by the time he got to India, it was his determination that he would write his missionary sending organization to declare that he had changed his doctrinal beliefs and was resigning from the very support base that had sent him. And then at the same time, he met William Carey, and one of Carey's associates, he asked if they could be baptized, so they were baptized, because he had come to believe that immersion was the way they should be baptized. And then they sent a letter, supportless, to America, asking at that time the feeble Baptist community if they would take them on as missionaries and support them. How's that for brave? All right. Not only that, but when they arrived in India, the East India Company under the British was the power force in India at that time, and basically controlled all the trade of India, and most of their trade was through very nefarious means, very ungodly, very wicked. And so the East India Company felt threatened by these young missionaries, figuring that if the Indians were taught about righteousness and truth and all these things, they would eventually revolt and they would lose their income. So they gave the missionaries the boot and told them that they had to leave India. So no sooner had they arrived on the field than they were told they had to leave. How's that for an arrival? All right. So they were kind of like preemptively ordered out of India by the East India Company. And after they were put on a boat, and after a long journey to the Isle of France, they returned to India and landed at Madras. And again, the East India Company ordered them to leave the country, or they would be deported back to England and America. And so they embarked on a ship called the Georgiana, which Judson described as a crazy old vessel. Don't know what that means. And for 3 weeks they are tossed about by a fierce monsoon in the Bay of Bengal. Anne became desperately ill. Judson expected her to die momentarily, attended by only her husband, Anne gave birth to their first baby, which soon died and was buried at sea. As they sailed into the harbor of Rangoon, Anne finally rallied, and so they arrived at a squalid, unspeakably filthy village whose uncivilized life had been utterly untouched and unsoftened by Western influence. Thus, the new young missionary couple arrived on the field for their first day of service. So there's a lot more description about how awful this place was when they first got there. But in addition to this, Burma, being Buddhist, was virtually untouched as a mission field. And so Adoniram set out to learn the language, and he studied it for several years. Meanwhile, his wife began to pick up the language just through her interactions with the Burmese women. Although her husband was the intellectual and was studying everything officially to grasp it and to speak it, his wife was actually, without trying, surpassing him in her linguistic abilities. As Adoniram learned how to speak the language, he was wrestling with how to be a missionary, how to get the message out. He even at one point tried to have a meeting with the Burmese magistrate and try to present the gospel to him, and he was sternly rebuffed and sent away. So what he did, he thought, well, I'm going to adopt the customs of the people, and so he built a zayat, a Z-A-Y-A-T, which was a customary bamboo shelter, and he set it up in front of his house. And when I read this story, all I could think about is Triple T and the little 10 by 10 shelters that we would set up. This is exactly what the dude did. He was out on the street, and he built a bamboo shelter, and he would yell out in Burmese, "Ho, everyone that thirsteth." It was a culture or a custom at the time for Burmese men. You know, it was a hot climate. Burmese men would come into these shelters, and they would shoot the breeze and discuss whatever. And so he thought, well, I'm going to build me one of those shelters, and I'm going to have all the Burmese men come, and we're going to have chats, and we're going to talk, and I'll share the gospel. And so he tried to interest the Burmese to discuss, the gospel. At the same time, he also was translating a Burmese grammar book, or he was writing, like a Burmese dictionary during that same time. And so while things didn't go so well during these days, he had tried to share with the Emperor of Burma, and it didn't go very well. And it took 12 years before Judson had made 18 converts. And anyway, what happened now is that there was a war between England and Burma, and the Burmese tried to exercise their independence over the British, and the missionaries got caught in the middle. And so while the English were looking for territory, Burma was looking for freedom. And so this war came out, and basically a lot of the missionaries were treated as English spies, even though they had nothing to do with it. And so Judson was imprisoned for 17 or 18 months. He was put into a small room, not much bigger than the one you're in, with about 50 people that hadn't been cleaned for years and wasn't cleaned for all the time that he was incarcerated there. The fetid smell, as you can imagine, was beyond comprehension. They were put into metal, their ankles and wrists were put into these chains, and at night, all of the shackled prisoners, they would take a long bamboo pole and they would run it through the legs of all of the prisoners, and then they would raise the bamboo, so they couldn't escape. They would raise the bamboo pole up into the air so that only their shoulders were barely touching the ground, and they would leave them like that all night. And perhaps even more amazing than he was so, the starvation and the deprivation that went on there, it was to a point where he pretty much lost his voice and couldn't even, I think the first time that his wife was allowed to come and visit him, she was shocked when she saw him. He was only able to crawl to meet her. It said Anne was perhaps the greater model of supreme courage. Heedless to all the threats against her, she was left alone as the only Western woman in an absolute anti-Christian monarchy, at war with the West, beset with raging fevers, nursing a tiny baby that her husband had not yet seen. She rushed from office to office in desperate attempts to keep her husband alive and win his freedom. The end of the war should have been a time of rejoicing for the mission. As soon as her husband was released by the Burmese, Anne wrote that one good result of the war could be that terms of the treaty which ceded Burmese provinces to the British might provide an opportunity to expand gospel witness. But on October 24th of 1826, Anne died, and she was the victim of a long, dreadful, months-long disease. And the stress and loneliness and the disease that had been hers for 21 months, their third child died 6 months later. And she died while her husband was exploring one of those provinces. And it was right about this time when she died and all of his kids had died that Adoniram had dropped into a severe depression. He quit doing ministry, he quit singing, he quit corresponding, he quit doing everything. He just went off grid for about a year. Maybe not unlike what you read about the prophet Elijah when he ran into the southern desert and said, "I'm no better than my ancestors, God, just take my life." That was kind of the attitude that Judson had at that time. He had gone through all of that prison time. He'd also been pressed by the British at the end of the war to become a translator against his will. And some of the Burmese people considered him imperialist because he was acting as a translator, not realizing that he didn't really have much. He didn't have much control over all that. Anyway, one of these fields that was opened up coincidentally, but really by divine appointment, was a field where a tribe of people known as the Karen were located. And the Karen people had a tradition or a belief in an eternal, all-powerful God who is creator of heaven and earth, and that man and a woman formed from his rib. They believed in humanity's temptation by a devil and its fall, and that someday a Messiah would come to its rescue. They lived in expectation of a prophecy that white foreigners would bring them a sacred parchment roll. And that was all part of their culture before Adoniram even showed up. And so anyway, they pressed into this area and began to evangelize along the river in that tiger-infested jungle area where the Karen people lived. And it was during that time in 1834, after 24 years, he finished his work on translating the entire Bible into the Burmese language. He'd married a widow of one of his missionary friends, Sarah Boardman, and they had 8 children, 5 whom survived to adulthood. And later on, Sarah Boardman also died, and he had gone back to the States for a little while during that time, and he met in 1846 a younger lady, much younger than him, Emily Chubbuck, which he married. I think she was 27 and he was in his 40s or 50s, so there was lots of talking amongst people about the difference in their age. She was a professional writer. She was an author, and anyway, they traveled back to Burma and had 4 of the best years of their life together. And then she also got sick and died. And not long after that, Judson became ill as well, and so they decided to take him out to sea, away from the Burmese and everything, and they put him on a ship. And while he was on the ship, he died. And so he was almost with the Burmese mountains, where you could see him in the distance. He was laid to rest at sea, and he died. But he had set out with very modest goals for evangelism. but the number of believers in Burma and the number of churches rose into the hundreds, and the number of people that traced their churches and their salvation back to Judson numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They were saying close to 500,000 of the Burmese people had come to know the Lord within a few years after Adoniram Judson served. And so he completed a Burmese grammar that is still today considered one of the best resources in their language, as well as the Burmese Bible, and did not witness all of it, but impacted the country with hundreds of churches founded, hundreds of thousands saved. I'm just going to close with a couple quotes. There is no success without sacrifice. If you succeed without sacrifice, it's because someone has suffered before you. If you sacrifice without success, it's because someone will succeed after. Another of his quotes is, "The future is as bright as the promises of God." He said, "Let me beg you not to rest contented with the commonplace religion that is so prevalent." He wrote to his supporters, he said, "Permit us to labor in obscurity, and at the end of 20 years, you may hear from us again." God loves importunate prayer so much that he will not give us much blessing without it. And then closing with these two verses from Luke 9, verses 22 and 23. "If anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life because of me will save it." That's it.
Thank you, Steve, on that biography. Good morning, everyone. Okay, today's Wednesday afternoon outside work day for everybody. So, students will be dressed out. Everybody else. Okay, any announcements? I know Bob came home yesterday, so the doctor also told him do not return to the office before Monday. So he's recuperating over the weekend. And all the ladies are still sick from IO. Tom, Linda's still down? Sean is still down? Okay. Kathy has a doctor appointment at 10, so pray for that. So let's pray, it's time. Father, I want to thank you for today. Just thank you for the blessings that you give us to be able to have a rest, to recoup and get strength, Lord, and for today, the safety that's going to be required with the work that's going on outside. Father, thank you for the students and give them the opportunity to get their work done in their classes, the teachers that come in and teach them, Lord, and just have a great day in all that we do. In your name, amen. Prayer closet, Anthony at 8:30, Bethany at 9, Josiah at